Are you looking for a view of the world that's a bit different? Hi, I'm Jason Palmer, a host of The Weekend Intelligence, a podcast from The Economist. Join us to hear the stories that matter most to our correspondents and editors. Every Saturday, we introduce you to people and ideas that take you outside the ordinary and expand your horizons one episode at a time. Join us and see the world from a new perspective. To keep listening after May 31st, subscribe to Economist Podcasts Plus. Now, 50% off.
I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Alex Hall, and this is Disorder,
a podcast where we try to uncover some of the hidden organizing principles at work, sometimes behind the scenes, in our mad, and sometimes quite corrupt world.
And in this episode, we drill down precisely on this issue of corruption. It's not just peripheral to disorder, it is the disorder. This is the first of a two-part interview with award-winning investigative journalist Tom Burgis. Jason and Tom discuss how laws and practices in the City of London and Washington, D.C. actually enable kleptocratic behaviour, with examples from places like Nigeria, Angola, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And after the interview, Jason and I will be discussing what kind of risks do such dirty dealings present to our own politics and security.
By chatting with Tom, we're going to see how corruption and the laws and international systems that facilitate it are core to the enduring disorder. That's this week in part one. Then in part two, coming next Tuesday, we're going to delve more deeply into how does this all affect the UK. And he tells us what he learned in his recent book, Cuckooland, How the Rich Own the Truth. Wow, it's going to be a wild ride hearing from Tom. And I'm going to tell you, it's controversial at points, so buckle up and let's get started. Tom, welcome to Disorder.
Yeah, it's very nice to be with you. Thanks for having me.
I really relished your first book, Looting Machine, about minerals in Africa. When I was reading it, I was like, wow, this guy has been to all these different places. He's seen the looting machine in action. I want to know, how did you get into journalism and what drew you into this field of illicit finance?
Well, I am a failed poet. I was wandering around in South America with a guitar and a notebook, having done an English degree in London in my early 20s, and I wound up on the Santiago Times, sadly not there anymore, but it was a wonderful little newspaper in Santiago in Chile. And then I just so happened to be in Chile when the reckoning with Pinochet happened. And one of the really striking things that happened there was that Pinochet had always put himself forward as a kind of moral force against the evils of communism. And his backers, people like Kissinger, took that same approach. But what was emerging was that he was also getting pretty fat out of all of this. There were the Riggs bank accounts emerged in DC where Pinochet was squirreling away a personal fortune. And that was my first view of how corruption underlies so often other stories that were told. Anyway, one way or another, I went on from there and covered a lot of the anti-globalization movement. I got tear-gassed all over the place. But it became clear to me that the place I really wanted to report from was Africa, because that seemed the cutting edge of where globalizing capitalism was causing the most pillage and harm. And I ended up going there as a correspondent for the Financial Times, to South Africa first, and then to West Africa, living in Lagos. And that's where the idea for the looting machine was born. It came from one particular massacre that I covered in central Nigeria, which was widely covered by me and others, as these things usually are, with a kind of broad brush, pretty patronizing, look at these Africans hacking each other to bits narrative. And I became pretty obsessed with it and tried to understand the big forces at work. And it seemed to me, ultimately, that what was at work was corruption. In a country where the state exists really only as a mechanism to enrich those who hold power, the difference between a life of excruciating poverty and one of plenty is overwhelmingly your ability to rise through that looting machine. And often that means securing support through what's sometimes called ethnic entrepreneurship. So whipping up ethnic hatreds as a way to give yourself a claim on some capillary or other of the oil money that tumbles down from the big pot up high. And that's what was going on in the city of Jos and the surrounding villages, was a competition for oil money in which people were enlisting and activating and stoking the ethnic feeling that can be activated in any of us to the point that villages were burning. And if you widen out and out and out and out, what are the engines of that oil industry? Well, they're the biggest multinational Western companies, Royal Dutch Shell and Exxon and so on. Their shareholders grow fat off the disorder of Nigeria. We all rely on Nigeria for, it used to be 1 barrel in every 50 odd of oil on which our economy is still run.
And if you're in one of these countries that consumes light crude like Italy, it's like 1 in every 5.
Yeah, but also the whole global oil market is a big barrel, isn't it? So the more that goes, we all rely for keeping the price where it is on supply from everywhere. So in that sense, I came to the conclusion that to a greater and lesser extent, we're all complicit in this violence that flows from global corruption.
The way that the sub-Saharan African oil and mineral exploitation has come about really showcases that corruption is the big story. It's not a peripheral story. And what I think your work shows is that so is offshoring of wealth. Can we get any accurate picture of has the question of offshoring of wealth globally increased over time?
Well, I think there's one massive example, obviously, which is the collapse of the Soviet Empire. I mean, arguably the greatest transfer of wealth that was held collectively to individuals ever. Whenever that kind of looting takes place, what you want to do is preserve the lawlessness that allows you to loot and then stash your lucre in a rule of law place where it can be protected from exactly the kind of looting that you've just enjoyed.
And this is a crucial point. It is that the global disorder favors those who want to do the looting. I want to really underline this point, because if we lived in a situation where there was really good global coordination, then the way that the FCPA works, this is the American legislation, which is essentially the blue chip international standard in combating global corruption by going after the Western companies who might pay for access or pay for their right to get a contract. And in a world of global order, the kind of looting and enrichment of Kazakh moguls would not be able to happen. Is that not correct?
If you had a system where corruption anywhere is prosecutable anywhere, if that was a global principle, yeah? What if you could police it that way? I think, obviously, in principle, yes, you would have to get over the difficulties of corruption cases being fantastically difficult to prosecute. But what's happening is the opposite, right? What's happening is that the institutions of law enforcement in the handful of countries where they genuinely exist are being hijacked by the kleptocrats. And I'd say the alliances that you describe in the global enduring disorder, I would call that kleptopia, right? I would call that networks of kleptocrats. Those kleptocrats are just as likely to be found in Moscow as they are in Washington. Or rather, I should say, in Washington as they are in Moscow. That people who are trying to essentially monetize public office, monetize public trust, essentially rule through corruption.
100%. This is a different way of articulating what I'm trying to say, which is that it is the very nature of the global enduring disorder that people have a stake in the disorder continuing, because that's how they monetize public office. And if everywhere was Scandinavia and New Zealand, you couldn't do it. I think, therefore, there is a class of entrenched, not only billionaires and autocrats and office seekers who need this system to continue, and it has a whole range of implications for how we live our lives, whether it's the war in Ukraine or the inability to regulate AI, that these things are somehow connected.
Yeah, but I think it's possibly even worse than that, which is that the interest of some, let's say, corrupt member of Putin's clique circle is not simply disordering international institutions of order, but hijacking them.
Yes.
So
Yes.
take Interpol. It's a
Yes,
fantastic
great
example.
point. Yes.
So the fundamental problem for law enforcement here is that money has gone global, but law enforcement has stayed national. Interpol is a partial solution to that. You can have a system where an upstanding Tanzanian anti-corruption prosecutor realizes that an aviation contract has been ripped off and the money has been stashed in a central London mansion. And Interpol is the system whereby you can put out, let's say, a red notice and say, actually, the former aviation minister who stole this money is in the UK. Could you please, the UK police, arrest him? Great. If the system worked like that, which fleetingly does, that would be perfect. But again and again and again, and increasingly, we hear the opposite, which is that a dictator in Kazakhstan, because he controls a state that's deemed to be legitimate because it's a state, he can say, or his police force can send a request, and this happened, send a request to the Italian police saying, please could you go and arrest that woman and child in Rome? And there may be some way of pinning financial crime on them, but what you're actually doing is arresting the wife and daughter of one of your major opponents who's gone into exile.
I want to ask you about commodities trading. When I engage with your work, Tom, it makes me wonder, is commodities trading, particularly after the nationalizations of oil in the 1970s, something that allows the money and commodities to flow in a opaque way between the quote-unquote over there and the here? And through your investigative journalist work, have you ever met the Rautenbachs or people who work at Glencore or Deutsches of the world? And if so, what were they like? What kind of characters are they?
So how do these commodity traders, these vast companies that most people have never heard of that operate out of Swiss villages and such like, how do they plug into this globalized kleptocracy that I'm trying to describe? They are central to it because the main thing that a kleptocrat has to sell is natural resources. That's how it works. That's a kleptocratic dictator. If you look at most of the world, most countries, where they intersect with the global economy is just through natural resources industries. I mean, that goes for almost all of Africa, huge parts of Latin America and Asia and so on. And so if you're able to capture power and you want to monetize that power, the way to do it is to auction access to natural resources. And this doesn't happen, obviously, in some sort of transparent way. What you get is these gigantic, very secretive commodity traders that receive even less scrutiny than the big oil and mining companies, which tend to be listed and so on. In Nigeria, you have the offtake agreements, as they're called, for oil. And they're immensely valuable, right? Because someone else is drilling the oil out of the ground. If you are the commodity trader, you take your cut on arranging for it to be shipped to wherever it needs to go. That fax of that contract from that, let's say, oil minister that simply says, Jason, your commodity trading company is getting it and not Tom's. That fax alone could be worth billions of dollars. No one's doing anything to earn any money here. You're just apportioning wealth. And so if I'm able to occupy that roadblock, if you like, in the system between the commodity trader and, on the other hand, the oil in the ground, that's an immensely valuable roadblock. And you see again and again in places like Angola, Nigeria, Congo, that the commodity traders are the absolute engine of some of the biggest and most enduring corruption, because you'll see relationships built between commodity traders and corrupt factions within the elite.
Yes, so the commodity traders, as you've sketched them, are operating in a kind of neo-medieval situation that a good is worth more in one place than another, so that if you can go around to the Spice Islands and you control the trade of this good, the salt or the clove or the whatever, and then you bring it back, it's worth more in place A than place B. And if you're the only one who can bring it back, you pocket this unearned labor of the price difference.
Right, but it's also, as you describe in your book, that this is all dressed up as free markets at work, and it's no such thing, right? This is absolute capture of enormous amounts of money that much of which should probably flow to the African state in question by a corrupt political cabal in cahoots with an opaque multinational corporation. These are the kleptocratic networks that are at play. And where we go wrong is to see a lot of the corruption is exported by Western corporations into those African political systems to exploit it.
That's well sketched, Tom. I think it's worth pointing out for our listeners that the oil industry and the minerals extraction industry are actually quite different in this way. And it's through reading your book and then thinking about my own work in North Africa and the Middle East, I've really reflected on how mineral extraction companies pay far less of their margins to the countries from which they mine than IOCs, international oil companies, pay to the countries in which they drill for oil. I want to know, why is that? Why is there no OPEC for specific minerals like bauxite, which is so important in aluminum production, or rare earths, or other minerals which come from sub-Saharan Africa, that the sub-Saharan African states get so much less of the margin of the minerals they possess than Saudi or Kuwait or Qatar get from the crude oil or the gas that they export?
Well, isn't that just because of the kind of central geostrategic importance of oil as a commodity has got you there? So
no, I'm going to disagree with that, because if you don't have access to aluminum, it becomes a very geostrategically important commodity, and that's extremely true with rare earths. I mean, we're in a situation now whereby if you can't get cobalt or lithium, those things are potentially even more geostrategically important. And when you get to the question of the, silicon wafers being the crude oil of the mid-21st century, you could argue that there are various commodities which are now geostrategically more important than crude oil. I mean, I'm answering my own question.
No, sure, but that's those industries haven't yet caught up with that cartel making, but that you would expect that to emerge now that shift in strategic importance between different minerals is taking place, between different commodities is taking place. I think, to take your point, I think Congo is a fantastic example of this, where you are seeing hugely increased strategic importance of cobalt and other minerals that sit in the copper belt of southern Congo. That is strengthening the bargaining power of the corrupt elites that control Congo. But I guess so often we make the mistake between thinking, by assuming that the rulers of, say, somewhere like the Democratic Republic of Congo are acting in the interest of that state, whereas, of course, they're acting in their own kleptocratic interest.
And if I could jump in, that to me is exactly it. I was asking a leading question on purpose. The oil cartel called OPEC came about during a period of relative global order. And that allowed a Venezuelan lawyer and philosopher to make common cause with his Kuwaiti and Iraqi oil minister friends. And they created a situation which caused a huge redistribution of global power and wealth. And it did so in a fairly ordered way. A lot of that wealth was then wasted, but it was having the potential to benefit the resource-producing countries. I don't think that would be possible now for some African states to have a copper mining cartel or a cobalt one, because I think we're not in an ordered world, and the coordination and collective action that would be required among those different producer states or rule of law or whatever would not actually work. So again, this is just, very postulating and you might say coffeehousing talk, but I think that OPEC came about was representative of the bipolarity of the Cold War and the rule of law, and it would be nearly impossible to recreate that.
Yeah, I think there's another aspect to it, which is that since the end of the Cold War and the accelerated globalization of finance, the ease with which looting can take place, the financial architecture, the architecture of kind of secrecy, law firms, PRs, and so on, that facilitate looting by, let's say, a Congolese dictator, is so turbocharged and so readily available that what's happened is it's accelerated the kind of detachment of corrupt ruling classes from the nations over which they rule. So the Mugabe regime in Zimbabwe was much more detached than a previous regime 20 or 30 years earlier would have been, because really the relationship is between multinational companies and multinational dictators. And therefore, the idea that you could have coordination between, let's say, the world's cobalt producers in the interests of those states is harder, because it's much harder to get the rulers of those states to act in the interests of those states.
You can see the global enduring disorder at work in the way that you've sketched that out now. To get the rulers of those states to act in the interests of those states is much harder now because the globalization of finance and commodities trading has cut the connection between the consent of the governed and the actions of the rulers. And we're in a situation without accountability at either the national or international levels.
Right. And this takes me back to my burned village in Nigeria. What is happening there? What is happening is that a couple of local political barons are whipping up ethnic hatred in order to strengthen their hold on local power and their ability to loot. The cost of that is terrible violence. But it comes from a rhetoric of collectiveness, right? We are all together. This, let's say, Christian group in this part of Nigeria, we are all together. I am your leader. I am your protector. It's the inversion of the truth.
It is the negative sum mentality, which I so experienced in Libya, which is that if everyone worked together, the pie would be bigger and we can all share. But the Misratan guy says, no, the Zawians are getting too much money. We need to take it from them. And it is a failure of imagination to understand that the world isn't negative sum, it isn't zero sum, it's so positive sum, but we're in a situation with neo-populism whereby not only over there, but Trump and Brexit employ they're stealing our jobs, let's block the migrants.
Right. But I suppose yes, exactly. And the point I'm trying to get to is I don't think it can be a coincidence that as you have this widening detachment of ruling elites all over the world, but especially in the big kleptocracies, from the interests of the governed, you also have this resurgence of narratives that paper that over. Resurgence of nationalism, populism, Putin's embrace of, let's say, the nationalist narratives of the Russian Orthodox Church. That is to belie the reality that these ruling cliques are living in Putin's palace and all their money is stashed in London, with a false narrative that says we are actually more in this together because we are united, us, we Russians, we Christians of plateau states, we MAGA Americans. That is the most magnificent kind of hoodwinking, whereas the opposite process is taking place, right? That internationally you get networks of kleptocrats whose interests are absolutely not the common interest of their nation state, but the aligned interest of their own self-enrichment.
100%. And with the Trump narrative of America First, ironically, he's working more with the leaders of the Emirates and Saudi Arabia and potentially Putin than any previous American president, because he shares not only his own personal interests with them, but a worldview, because the very nature of his family state and his relationship with Jared Kushner and his hangers-on mirrors that of an Emirati Emir.
Yeah, but if you can call it a worldview, it's a sort of personal view, isn't it? I spent a lot of time working when Trump was rising, to some of this material is in Kleptopia, my second book, just charting the extent to which Trump is a creature of dirty money from the former Soviet Union.
100%.
So this is a kind of different debate, although it overlaps with the kind of, is Trump some kind of agent of Russian intelligence, which is a much more vexed thing. But is Trump a product of exactly this kind of, these huge flows of wealth from the big ex-Soviet kleptocracies? 100%.
Of course. And to interject for particularly our non-American listeners, he didn't make money in Atlantic City with those casinos. He went bust. Who bailed him out? Deutsche Bank. Where did the money to come to bail him out from? The former Soviet Union. When he went bust and Deutsche Bank had to eat it, Deutsche Bank said they're never going to lend to him again. They lent to him again. Why? Because former Soviet potentates put money into Trump specifically, which allowed some of the hotel deals. And then those hotels also didn't make money, and he went bust and he stiffed the contractors. And he got new rounds of money. And obviously we digress, and I want to come back to, certain issues that you've written about. But why? Why did they put this money into Trump knowing that they wouldn't get these returns?
For me, it's quite simple. That if we're taking examples of people whose money is tainted, right, is dirty, there's always a fee to launder that, right? It's 20% sometimes. If you're trying to take money that you've stolen, right, and make it look clean, whoever is achieving that for you, whichever fixer, money launderer, estate agent, whatever it may be, banker is doing that for you, is obviously going to take a cut, a big cut, because that's dangerous work. You can go to jail for doing that. Now, Trump's model is he's a failed businessman around the turn of the century, but he has an image thanks to reality TV as a kind of ersatz tycoon. It's completely false. Yeah, he just lost all his money. He's hopeless at business, Donald Trump. But he has the Trump brand, right? The brand, this ethereal thing. And so if you have made money in dubious circumstances in the former Soviet Union, and you're looking for someone in the West, in the rule of law states, where you can park that money in a real estate project, which is the great engine of money laundering, Trump is absolutely perfect. He will rent out his name to you for a cut. This thing that gets built somewhere will be called the Trump Tower, whatever it is. You will chuck in a load of money. Maybe it does go bust, but money might have come out to the other side to contractors linked to you. If you get any return, if you keep any of that money, that's a boon for you because you stole it all in the first place.
And this is an essential point. This shows you the way in which corruption is not peripheral to the story. It is the story. And increasingly, as a bizarre kind of neoliberal capitalism has been globalized, we get a situation where laundering the money of the fire sale of the former statist assets is the story. It's not peripheral. Oh, we'd like those minerals a little bit cheaper than you would otherwise give them. Here's a bribe. No.
This is exactly bringing you back to your point a moment ago. This is why it's central, because how does Trump govern when he gets into office? He governs like a kleptocrat. Anyone who's ever covered a Nigerian election was like, Trump is a Nigerian politician. He's absorbed as much dirty money as he possibly can as a businessman to sustain himself. And then in office, what's his outlook? His outlook is to monetize power. Look at all those people around him who've gone down for corruption. He's not a true believer in some MAGA project. No more than Putin is a devout Orthodox Christian. These are the narratives with which they paper over the real project, disguise the real project, which is self-enrichment. And if you look at the natural alliances Trump made in office, they were all alliances and kleptocrats, whether that's in North Korea or Russia or the Gulf. And then you get the same dynamic that you see in every Nigerian election. What's Trump doing now? Trying to stay out of jail. In Nigeria, and I'd say the majority of countries, the main goal of taking political power is to enrich yourself. The main goal of keeping political power is to stay out of jail. That Trump has simply carried the dynamic that is at work in the places that were enriching him when he was a businessman into US politics. That's all that's happened.
Yeah, and that's why it is your experiences in Nigeria and mine in Libya that I think give us unique insights into MAGA and to Brexit. And I can understand Netanyahu and why the war needs to continue.
Same reason.
Because he has to just stay out of jail. And the only way that he can stay out of jail is to stay in power. And he needs the settler parties and whatever to stay in power. And therefore the war continues.
Same reason. And I think this is the thing in all these years of being a foreign correspondent and investigative reporter writing this book, this is where you end up, is individual motivation and the psychology that's at work here. Netanyahu is trying to stay out of jail on corruption charges. And I think it's not unreasonable to see that as the engine of so much that's happening. The same with Trump, the same with generation after generation of Nigerian politicians.
Yes.
But so often we just ignore these
and that's why
motivations.
This academic turn away from diplomatic history, and they poo-poo big man history. When I was at Oxford and Cambridge, my supervisor would be like, oh, you seem to be a diplomatic historian. We don't do that anymore. We only do, social history of feminist authors and whatever. And I'm like, that is very interesting. But diplomatic and big man history is so much of how the main events of the world are driven. And people would like to dig their head in the sands and not look at these topics. And it's not just on the right that they don't want to look at them. I'm saying in the left and the academy, they don't even want to stare at these things.
But I think this is where this brings us to the enduring disorder, right? In the sense that what is the motivation or why is it that these disorderers, these kleptocrats seek to destabilize the institutions of freedom, the rule of law, parliaments, free press, and so on? It's because the very purpose of those institutions, the heart of free society, is to try to prevent corruption. And corruption at its heart is simply the abuse of public office for private gain, right? We talk about the financial aspect of corruption all the time, but fundamentally we're talking about taking public office, taking a position of public trust and using that for your personal benefit. And it can be in ways more subtle than simply taking a kickback. But these institutions that have developed those three crucial ones, parliaments, the rule of law, the free press, at their heart, they are all about trying to ensure that power is used for the wider good, right? Which is the opposite impulse of corruption.
After the break, Tom and I discuss how the rich have ended up manipulating and controlling what we consider the truth. Throughout human history, money has always bought influence. And the influence can be used to generate money. But what's changed in the last 30 years, Tom? Anything? Did the robber barons in the USA in the 1880s and the aristocrats in Britain in the 19th century always use untraceable money to influence media coverage?
I think that part of what has changed, let's take the UK, is that two developments have happened at the same time. One is that the newspaper industry has collapsed, the news industry more broadly. Its business model was broken by the internet. All advertising used to be shared between, let's say, a dozen print publications, and now it's shared between 100,000 websites. So the business model of the news is broken, and the newspaper news drives a lot of what ends up in broadcast news. At the same time, you've had the rise of an oligarchy from the former Soviet Union, but also worldwide, a plutocracy, you might call it instead. And those mega rich want what the mega rich have always wanted, which is to curate their own image. What you see now is a debilitated news media going up against an industry that really grew up to serve those who became fantastically rich and from the rubble of the Soviet Union. They didn't want to be seen as thieves and gangsters and so on, but wanted to be seen as visionary tycoons and entrepreneurs, statesmen and so on. So a reputation fabrication industry grew up. This is law firms, they're called reputation management law firms, incredibly powerful and wealthy. An enormous PR industry, a private intelligence industry and so on, one of whose central purposes was you could hire them and they will make reality what you want it to be. They will make the account of you, the version of you that exists in the public square, what you want it to be. And what's terrifying about that is you can't really have a free society unless there is open interrogation of each of our characters. You can't choose who you would like to be in office. You can't choose if someone is a reasonable person to run a school or an important business or whatever it may be, unless we're able to inquire into each other's character and behaviour. And that's what's being shut down.
That's a great place for us to jump off more about your recent excellent book, Cuckooland, How the Rich Own the Truth. When the average person thinks of a corrupt transaction in a third world country, I think they visualize paying a bribe in a brown paper envelope to a government official to get the ability to mine the precious metal or drill for oil. So let's talk a little bit of telecoms. I don't think that people think about telecoms and bribery. Why did the telecoms industry attract bribery and the shadowy relationships between ministers, intermediaries, and the multinational telecom companies?
I mean, it's quite literally making money out of air, isn't it? Out of airwaves. As you head out of the end of the Cold War and this new period of globalization accelerates, a lot of the oil and mining resources of the world are spoken for. There are giant multinational companies that have been operating in, let's say, West Africa since long before independence. You've got the rise of state-owned oil companies and so on. But then what you have is completely virgin territory of the communications industry. Right? So spectrum is the new oil in that sense. If you are an ambitious young kleptocrat in literally anywhere, where once, the real killer job would have been oil minister, handing out the oil contracts, what about being telecoms minister? Everyone's coming to you, all these vast and quickly expanding telecoms companies that have quickly saturated the rich markets, right? North America, Western Europe. Everyone's quickly got a phone. They see these huge virgin territories, especially the former Soviet Union, and the Gulf, places that are rich enough to afford mobile phones, but where closed markets and dictatorships have made the penetration of the industry slower. They all want to go in there. And one of the huge ones is TeliaSonera from Scandinavia. based in Sweden. And what they do is they embark on, for a few years, an extraordinary campaign to try to get access to these telecoms markets of the former Soviet Union. And at the heart of Cuckooland is this kind of rush for the new oil, for spectrum, and what big Western companies were prepared to do to gain access to those markets, and the accommodations they were prepared to make with the often kleptocratic, violent, repressive regimes there. And this is one of the ironies that applies just to the telecoms industry as opposed to those other ones, which is that the telecoms industry is often presented as a red carpet to freedom. So by bringing telecoms technology to countries that have long suffered under repressive regimes, we, being Westerners or a big telecoms company, are providing the means for freedom, the means for emancipation. And there are going to be 1,000 Tahrir squares. And the spread of these devices is hastening freedom. Whereas in fact, what was going on in some cases, such as Uzbekistan, was that these companies trumpeting themselves as deliverance, as the bringers of Western-style freedoms through technology, were actually paying enormous bribes that helped to cement in office the violent kleptocracies that are the opposite of that promised freedom.
And I think that there's something that connects telecom to mining and oil that may not be obvious to all listeners. And this is the tremendous nature of the first mover advantage and having the infrastructure. It's a natural monopoly. You might argue that all of capitalism is a natural monopoly. But if we look at Facebook, once you already have the 1 billion users, it's really difficult to have a competing social network. But that's all online. You could do it. It's not a natural monopoly. Whereas when you own all the telecom infrastructure, particularly in these societies where the state is the only one who grants the permit for it, you own the thing and then you charge more, the Wi-Fi cuts out, and you still can charge whatever because the guy needs internet on his phone. And there's no one else that has the cell phone towers and no one else has the permission to build them because the government won't give them the permission. So it is the classic natural monopoly. And I think that that is key when you're thinking about why this industry allowed that kind of corruption.
Yeah, but there is another aspect to it as well, which is very well suited to kleptocracy in this way, which is that, let's say there's a change of regime in Kazakhstan. They're pretty rare in many of these places, changes of regimes, because they're run by dictators. And it's quite hard to get your turn at the trough with the oil industry because oil projects go on for decades. The great thing with telecoms, why it's really, let's say that ambitious young kleptocrat has got to the Uzbek telecoms minister position. The great thing with telecoms is you constantly got your finger on the switch. So it can be like, well, I'm very delighted that you paid me those bribes for the initial license to set up your telecoms company. However, I've got lots of mouths to feed. I'm going to need some more bribes. To which the multinational might say, I'd rather not pay you more bribes. To which the minister can say, well, I can literally just turn you off. And this, we see this again and again and again in what I've been looking at over these last few years, is that a kleptocratic regime can destabilize telecoms companies in all sorts of ways, including just withdrawing a license, saying, got to switch that off right now. And there'll be public outcry. We want our cell phone service back. The bribe goes in, the service goes back.
Yes, it affects people more immediately than whether the oil is being produced or not.
And you obviously can destabilize the oil industry and the mining industry, and that happens all the time. But I'm just saying telecoms is uniquely suited.
People. Yeah, exactly.
Uniquely suited to that.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about some of the human stories here. I mean, you talk fascinatingly about the nexus between Leonid Ryman and his fixer, Jeffrey Gallman, Putin's wife, Ludmila, and then Mohammad Mursi. Obviously, these are all larger-than-life characters. But what I want to ask you is, why does the minister even need a fixer to get rich? Like, there's the fixer that you talk about in Nepal, Ajaya Sumargi. Who are these kind of characters? Why are these fixers needed? You've met them. Tell us a little bit about that.
They're the interface. So this whole game is about connecting Western capital with kleptocratic power. Those two things want to meet, don't they? So the Western oil or telecoms or mining company wants access to Congo, Kazakhstan, Nepal, because it can make money there, and its executives and shareholders will get rich. The kleptocrat wants to monetize his power. But you can't do that tango directly.
Why not?
Because it would fall foul of Western law.
That's the reason. Okay, that's key.
Yeah.
So the interface is not, in a truly lawless world, you could just meet directly. Mm-hmm. But because of the way the FCPA and the UK law and other things work, you need this interface for kind of plausible deniability.
Yeah, it's partly because of, obviously, legal risk that under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or the UK Bribery Act, you might get done. There is that risk, but there's also just the reality that needs to be sculpted and maintained, and that is that Nursultan Nazarbayev is not a crook and a kleptocrat, he is a statesman. And for all sorts of reasons that's important, including...
Right, even for his domestic reasons, because I think a crucial point is that from the most dictatorial regime like Russia or a Arabian Gulf Emirate, the people's thoughts still do matter.
Right, and remember, we've talked about this, the narrative is, I am your leader, I am your protector.
Correct.
It comes back to Pinochet, doesn't it? That the exposure of grubby personal self-enrichment, there's only so much of that narrative can survive. So for domestic reasons, yes, you have to maintain the illusion of probity, while also everybody knowing that if you do what I want, you might get a bit of this. You might get a go at this trough. You need those two realities at the same time, one public, one unspoken. But similarly in the West, the founding principle or the governing principle of Western kind of economics is that it's lawful. But the way it's practiced, almost everywhere else in the world, is unlawful, is illegal. It involves doing business with corrupt regimes. And those corrupt regimes don't let you function unless you enrich them in some way. And in order to maintain that dualism, you need to have the narrative of probity. And that brings us back to the fixers, right? The go-betweens. These are the people who bring the mirror, who bring the looking glass that you can step through. And they are geniuses of crafting corrupt deals that look legit.
So Jason, that was a really fascinating interview. Thank you so much for talking all those issues through with Tom. And next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about how this plays out specifically in the UK. But one of the things that I really picked up on in your interview for this episode was this issue of the kind of the deal makers, the fixers in the middle who enable these practices. And they enable it in such a way that there is plausible deniability on both sides. And you just wonder, what kind of person is that middleman? Well, right now, there's a new book coming out about a fascinating, very colourful character known as, quote, Fat Leonard. And the book is called Fat Leonard, How One Man Bribed, Bilked and Seduced the US Navy. And this is the story of a Malaysian fixer and wheeler dealer who in the early 2000s fleeced absolutely millions of dollars from the US Navy by acting as a kind of go-between fixer for when US Navy ships came into harbour in any country around the world. Fat Leonard was the guy who won the contract to resupply the ships, offer them security while they were in harbour, even draining the sewage from the ships. No job was too dirty. The point was he got the contracts. And how he got the contracts was by seducing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of US Navy officers with bribes, prostitutes, parties, champagne. I mean, it was so tawdry. Fat Leonard ultimately was caught, but the investigations into the US Navy are going on and on and on. And the issue in this book, as they're saying, it's actually a security risk to the US military, the fact that this kind of corruption exists. And that's the point of this corruption. It's exactly what you and Tom were talking about. This isn't some peripheral thing where some money gets siphoned off and it doesn't come back to hurt us. No, this is something that infects the heart of our societies and can affect our national security. What do you think, Jason?
Yeah, Alex, so there are 2 points here. The point about the middlemen and then the point about corruption at the center of our global story. This is, to me, the zinger of the interview. My view 10 years ago was, corruption is probably important to understanding Kazakhstan and maybe Equatorial Guinea, but it's not the major global story. But what you get from Tom is that corruption is too small a term. The very nature of how resource-producing countries and former Soviet countries are connected to the global economy is through channels of illicit gain and corruption for some, and that the very channels of the global economy, which we think are privatized and neoliberal and market-based, the things that has connected East and West and global South and North are these channels of illicit gain, and they're at the very root of how the commodities trading industry has always worked. So, Alex, is corruption, kleptocracy, tax havens, and the desire to recycle stolen cash essential to how we have to understand the enduring disorder and how we have to present our disorder pod?
I think it is. I'm having a kind of light bulb moment, very similar to the light bulb moment I had watching Brexit play out in the UK. That Brexit was a symptom of things that weren't working properly, and all these scandals that have been taking place in British politics, like the sewage scandal, the postmaster scandal, the tainted blood scandal, the PPE contracts for sort of dodgy COVID health and safety protective gowns involving Baroness Mone. These aren't all isolated incidents. They're all kind of manifestations of a system that isn't working. And our independent institutions are no longer able to hold these things to account. And so there is a thread running through it. And the point that you and Tom drew out, and the question I was asking myself when I was listening to your interview, is, has this always been the case through the ages, or has something happened more recently that makes this worse? Yes, there've always been dirty traders, there've always been authoritarians, there've always been people hoping to make a fast buck. There were profiteers in the Civil War, there were profiteers in World War I and World War II. There are always people looking to game the system. We had slave traders, for God's sake. But the issue is that the sheer speed of financial transactions, because of this global connectivity and the fact that it's all done digitally, and the weapons of disinformation allow it to happen at a pace and at a scale we haven't seen before.
I think that's right, Alex. The pace and the scale is what's different, not the phenomenon itself. But going back to your brilliant way of putting it, so much of the disorder that we see around us is the symptoms. People mistake the symptoms for the cause. So they look at Brexit or Trump or the post office scandal and they say, isn't that horrible? Look at all the negative things this is going to lead to. It's not that that's the cause. That's the symptom. In fact, Alex, that's such a brilliant way of putting it. I have to say, I wish I'd thought of that myself. Oh, but I did, because that's exactly the language that I have in my book, Libya and the Global Enduring Disorder. And I talked about
the book.
I talked about this in 2019, 2020, when I was having a very similar realization to Alex. It was, for me, also looking at Brexit and Trump, and particularly that Trump could have policies which were different than those of the very State Department officials he had himself appointed. Not the deep state, but the Rex Tillerson that he appointed. And it just hit me, whoa, these things are these crazy symptoms of antecedent fuck-uppedness. But What can we do? We've got to prevent this downward slide. I had thought that the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that we defined earlier, was actually doing a pretty good job in America, and the corresponding legislations in Britain and Europe were really doing a good job of punishing companies and deterring them. I want to point out that it's not all doom and gloom here. The reason that Tom Burgis is able to write such a revealing book is that the perpetrators, like TeliaSonera, they faced billion-dollar fines. They lost in court. And he's allowed to publish this stuff because it's in the public record. The bad guys got caught. So I want to say maybe there is a glass half full aspect here, which is that the international community has good pieces of legislation. It is curtailing some corrupt behavior. I am not an expert on this domain, so I don't know if the things that Tom is revealing are the tip of the iceberg where we've caught the bad guys and punished them, but 98% of the iceberg is below water, or if actually the authorities, the DOJ and whatever, and Biden's people have done a really good job of exposing shadowy stuff, and we're fighting corruption better than we did before. How do you perceive that, Alex?
So I think we do have a huge asset, both in the US and in the UK. The two countries I know best. I'm not going to try and generalize across the West. And that is that actually most ordinary people really don't like corruption and unfairness. It is, I think, fairly embedded in our value set about fairness, sense of play, rule of law. What we're talking about is the behaviour of certain well-connected elites and their efforts to corrupt certain political leaders. But it's small and it can be very dangerous, but it's not widespread and it's not in any way regarded as acceptable. And so when we do come across examples of corrupt practice, even if it's just the fairly small scale, like taking cash to ask questions in the House of Commons, just for like a few $1,000s, which is just ridiculous, the general public actually is really upset by that. And that is fueling a debate. We do need to change the system. And then when Russia invaded Ukraine and there was renewed scrutiny of the connections between the Conservative Party and Russian donors, the amount of oligarchs' money based in London, there was also a reaction to that because this isn't something that is acceptable in our broader society. So even if corrupt barons control large swathes of our media, even if there are libel suits brought against some investigative journalists, it's pretty hard to close the whole system down. This is not acceptable. We are not corrupt societies where everybody is doing it. There is a genuine outrage. So I don't think all is lost. I feel like, on the whole, we still have a chance to nip this in the bud, but it does require giving our regulators more resources.
Yeah, the Anglo-American tradition really values fair play, and people root for the underdog. And when these things are exposed, people want the powerful to be kept in check. And I don't despair that we will have democracy and that there won't just be an unbelievable concentration of power into a few tech bros, because although there are all these structural forces pushing in that direction, there are centuries of culture in the Anglosphere which inform people's choices, that they want a more egalitarian society where the middle class has an important role. And in fact, we had the robber barons in the US in the 1880s, and we then had the rise of antitrust legislation, and things were pulled back. And the middle class after World War II was so much stronger than it had been in the Depression or the early pre-World War I period. So there are reasons to think that these things go in cycles. In fact, there are reasons to think that plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, because didn't the aristocrats in Britain in the 19th century and American robber barons in the 1880s use untraceable money to influence media coverage? Didn't they buy newspapers? And that's just the same thing as what Tom Burgis is describing. Now it's like misinformation in Twitter and libel suits in, the Chancellery Court. But, then it was buying newspapers, and somehow we survived that. So I don't want to be, DEFCON 5 here. Influence has always been used to generate money, and money was always used to buy influence. In the last 30 years, maybe the way you buy influence is different. Maybe the way in which money flows from Kazakhstan to a Swiss bank account to the Cayman Islands is slightly different than the way that people got rich in the past. But this isn't really that new a story. What I think is really dynamic and interesting is the unique ways in which this story is now central to globalization and geopolitics. And I want you guys to join us, you, my treasured orderers. Join us for part 2, where we focus more on Tom Burgis's new book, Cuckooland, Where the Rich Own the Truth. And we hear some of these fascinating stories from Kazakhstan and Africa and Russia, and how it has actually affected British and American politics. So that is more than enough from me, Alex.
That's definitely enough from you, Jason. And it's certainly enough from me too. So thank you very much for listening. Join us next week. This is a great topic, and I suspect we will be coming back to it again and again. And if you want to help us order the disorder, please tap follow right now, and you'll be notified when every episode launches. And also, every so often, Jason and I will have a talkathon where we take questions, and we're always interested in comments, feedback, reactions. So please do drop us an email at disordershow@gmail.com.
Alex, every week with you and I, it's a talkathon. And if you want to find out more about these topics that we cover, please subscribe to our Substack. It's free to join. There's also a pay for extra content for the mega orderers out there. And if you're a mega orderer, then you can write us at disordershow@gmail.com, suggest a guest that you'd really like to hear from, or a topic that we should delve more deeply into. As always, our producer is the one, the only, the George McDonough, and our executive producer is Neil Fern.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an orderly week, and listen to us next week.